welcome to W&M Essentials of Flyfishing Instructional DVD. My name is Al Noriker, and I'll be your host today as we take you through all the steps necessary to become better fly fishermen or fly girls. Now, before we head out on the water to practice our casting and presentation techniques, let's talk about some of the tools and accessories that are going to make your time on the water much more efficient and much easier. One of the most important accessories a fly fisherman can own is a great pair of breathable waders. Keeps you cool in the summertime, warm in the wintertime. It also gives you the ability to be mobile and get to where those fish are living. The next accessory I want to talk about is a tool that no fly fisherman can go to the river without, and that's a quality pair of line nippers. Every time you add tippet material onto your leader, or every time you tie on a new fly, you're going to need this to cut off that last little piece of monofilament line. Another multi-use tool that the fly fisherman really needs to have when he goes to the water is a forceps. Some people will call these a hemostat. This tool can be used for a couple different things. First of all, after you've landed that nice big fish, it's very easy to reach down when that fish is in the net and remove the hook from the jaw without even lifting the fish out of the water. The second thing this is used for is to pinch the barb down on flies. Now, we like to practice catch and release as often as possible, and by flattening that barb out, it makes it very easy to remove that hook. Depending on the time of year and where you're fishing, some days you might be throwing more dry flies, other days you might be throwing more subsurface flies. Now, if you're throwing dries, it's often a very good idea to have a small bottle of floatant. What this does, it helps keep that fly higher in the water and more visible to you and to the fish. On the days that you're going to be throwing subsurface flies, strike indicators are a very important part of that presentation technique. Now, there's lots of different types of strike indicators out there. There's foam indicators. There's indicators that are made mostly of a nylon material that are brightly colored. They float very good, but they normally have to be coated with that same dry fly floatant that you would use on the fly itself. One of my favorite strike indicators is called the thingamabobber. Not only is it a great name, but it floats higher and looks better in the water than any other strike indicator I've ever used. It comes in lots of different sizes. Bright colors. It even comes in a new black color as well as a glow-in-the-dark. Now, there's one accessory that not everybody thinks about as being a true fly fishing accessory, but it's one of those things that you'll never see me go to the water without, and that's a good quality pair of polarized sunglasses. Now, polarized sunglasses not only keep the glare off your eyes in bright light conditions, but they also give you the ability to look through the surface of the water and be able to see fish where you might not have been able to do that without those. In addition to that, in those bright, glaring conditions on the surface of the water, you'll be able to see your dry fly float much easier. You'll be able to see the takes and be ready to set that hook much better than without those glasses. Now, if you're fishing subsurface flies, one of the biggest mistakes I see people make is not getting deep enough. They're not getting down to where those fish are actually feeding. So we have a couple ways we can do that. One is to use a fly that is heavily weighted itself, or we can add some additional split shot about 18 to 20 inches above that fly to get it down to that feeding zone. Now, the split shot dispenser that I recommend is the new Wright McGill Quick Drop Shot Dispenser. Each one of the dispensers holds two sizes of non-lead, non-toxic split shot. Every time you push the button, you get one piece of non-lead shot out. Very easy. You don't drop any, you don't waste any, and you've got the perfect size split shot for the type of fishing you're doing right then. One of the last things that you're going to need to have is a good landing net. I suggest you find a net that has a very shallow design and is made of a soft rubber material. It's not only easy to release the fish out of a net like this, but it's much easier on the fish itself. Well, we've shown you the tools and accessories that every fly fisherman is going to need. Now let me teach you how to tie the 4 most important knots that every fly fisherman needs to know how to tie in order to be successful. To do that, let's head out on the water, and let's do this under real fishing conditions. Hey everybody, we're out here on the river now. We're about ready to go fishing. We're going to talk about knots in just a second, but I want to give you a quick tip, all right? Now, we've had this reel stored in our car for a little while, and depending on how long you go in between fishing trips, here's a little tip for you. It'll make it a lot easier to get started. First of all, let's just strip off a bunch of line, and you're seeing what's happening here already. You've got a lot of curl within your leader. The same thing is going to happen to the line itself. You've got all these little curls. Now, if you don't straighten that out, at least in the first 30 feet, it's going to make it very difficult to start casting. So we're going to strip off about 30 feet of line. It's a very simple process. All I'm going to do is I'm going to stretch. This is nice, stretchable line, floats very high in the water. But if I just tug on it a little bit, just like that, the entire 30 feet length, and you can already see what's happening. It lays much, much straighter. This side I haven't stretched yet. This side I have just stretched and it's hanging nice and straight. And if you'll do that every time before you get started, you'll have much better luck on the river. Now, don't forget to do the same thing to your leader material. Again, it's monofilament line. It stretches very easy. Just give it a little tug. You know, this is also a great way to test your leader. Okay? If you've got any little breaks inside of that or any little nicks, when you go to tug on it like this, it's going to break then. Much rather have it break when you're testing it and straightening it out than when you hook up that big old fish, right? Okay, so you just straighten that line out. There you go. You got a nice straight leader to get started, much easier to cast, much better presentations on the water. All right, now that we've done that, how do you string it through the guides on your fly rod? Well, a lot of people, when they're first starting, will grab the very end of this tippet material and start running that through the guides. Okay, well, first of all, this is very thin material, kind of hard to see because it's clear, like this. I'm having kind of a hard time already. And they'll start working that. If they happen to drop that, boom, it goes all the way back through the guides. You got to start all over again. So let me show you a little easier way. Let's take the fly line, and we're just going to double the fly line over and make a little loop like this. And you see how much easier that is? I can run that up through the guides. We'll go all the way through the top. Need a little bit more line to finish it off. Very easy process. Trust me, it sounds like a very little thing, but it's very easy. Now, when you get to the top, if I just simply find the section that's loose, that's not connected to the fly reel, and I just pull it through, and pretty soon, here comes my leader. Perfect. And I'm done. I'm ready to attach a fly, and I'm ready to go fishing. Small tip. It'll help you out a lot, save you some time, and make the process a lot easier. Before we start talking about knots, let's talk about leaders and tippets for just a minute. You have your fly line on your rod, but you also need a leader that connects the fly line to your fly. Now, there's lots of different kinds of leader material out there, both monofilament and what we call fluorocarbon, which is actually almost invisible under the surface of the water. It's a little more expensive. I personally believe it's worth it. I think the Cigar brand is a very good quality tippet material, but no matter what kind that you use, I want to show you something here. This is a small piece of leader material, okay? And it's very strong, even though it's very, very thin. But I want to show you something. I'm pulling on that really hard. You can actually see it stretch. I want to warn you against something, and that is wind knots. When you're casting a fly rod, inevitably you're going to get a wind knot, okay? Now, I'm just going to put a little overhand knot in this piece of tippet material. And you saw how hard I pulled on it a minute ago as I was stretching it. Now watch. Look at that. One little overhand knot or a wind knot in your tippet material, and you're going to lose that next fish that you hook up. So, as I was stretching that line to begin with at the start of the day, you notice that it not only was straightening the line, but it's also checking for those wind knots and those small abrasions in your leader so that you don't have that kind of failure when you have a fish on. So, strongly encourage you, check those leaders before you start fishing. Make sure there's no wind knots in there. Okay, let's talk about leaders and tippet. What the heck is the difference between a leader and a tippet? Well, a leader typically comes in a package like this. This one happens to be 9 feet long, and it's a 2X. 2X is the diameter of the material itself. Now, on a leader like this, what you're actually going to see when you take it out of the package is one end is pretty darn thick. The other end is very thin. The thick end actually connects to your fly line. After you've run it all the way through your guides, now we're going to attach a leader to the fly line itself. And to do that, we're going to use a nail knot. Okay, but before we do that, let's think about leader material. There's lots of different sizes. You're going to see 7.5 feet long, 8 feet long, 9 feet long, even up to 12-foot long leader material. And again, one end is very thick, the other end is very small. In this case, 2x small. You'll be able to buy tippet material from, say, a 0x all the way up to about a 6x diameter size. Now, for most of the fishing that we do, we're going to use between 4 and 6x as far as diameter, where it actually attaches to the fly itself. So, I'll often buy a leader that is only 7.5 feet long and 2 or 3x, and then I'm going to add tippet material, say a 6x or a 4x or a 5x tippet to the end of that leader. So really what you have is you have leader material that starts very thick at one end, comes down to a pretty small diameter. That's the actual leader. The tippet material is the smallest part that connects to the fly from the end of the leader. So we're going to talk about how we attach that in a minute too. Those are going to be called either a blood knot or a triple surgeon knot. Very easy to tie, and I'll show you how to do that as well. Let's talk about leader material a little bit. This is actually called tippet, happens to be fluorocarbon. Now, with leader material, there's both monofilament and fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon is a lot more expensive, roughly 2 to 3 times, sometimes even 4 times more expensive than regular monofilament. But the advantage is, for the diameter, it's very small, okay, and it's also very strong. Biggest advantage, of course, is the fact that it is virtually invisible under the surface of the water. In many cases, you can get by using a larger diameter, in other words, stronger tippet material, using fluorocarbon, and still have the ability to catch fish because the line is virtually invisible under the surface of the water. Now, this happens to be a 6X tippet material. It's made by Cigar, called Grand Max fluorocarbon. You'll notice that it comes in small spools of 25 yards long. The diameter is 0.005 inches in diameter, so it's very, very small, but it's still 3.7 pounds breaking strength, so it's very strong material. You'll want to have an assortment of leader material or tippet material in your pack system. This one's a 4X. Now, if I was to have an assortment of material in my pack, I usually carry 4 different sizes. I've already built my leader, so all I'm going to be doing is adding on tippet material at the end. And I'll carry 4X, 5X, 6X, and usually even a 7X in case I'm fishing very, very tiny little flies, and if the fish are pretty finicky and not wanting to strike at a fly attached to a thicker diameter tippet. So I strongly suggest you have a 4, 5, 6, and even a 7X tippet material in your pack so you can change it out based on the fishing conditions. We'll take another quick look at this leader material. This is how it comes packaged. You'll see this is a 9-foot long 2X fluorocarbon leader. And inside of this will be all wound up, 9 feet long, starting very thick on one end, down to that 2X diameter, which is 0.02 inches in diameter, with a breaking strength of 8 pounds. Now, please don't misunderstand something. A 6X tippet material with only 3.7 pound breaking strength. That doesn't mean that if you catch a 5-pound fish, you're going to break that fish off. Think about it. This line will actually stretch a little bit. Your rod has a lot of bend to it. It acts like a shock absorber. So you can actually use very small diameter, very light breaking strength tippet and still catch very, very big fish. You don't need to think about matching the size of fish that you're going to catch with the pound breaking strength on your tippet. What you're trying to match up is the size of the tippet material that matches best with the size of fly that you're going to use and the general fishing conditions. Now, if I'm fishing a very small size 20 nymph under a strike indicator, I'm going to have to use at least a 6X tippet because that fly is so small and the eye on the fly is so small that I'm not going to be able to even get that thicker material through that. So I'm going to have to go down to this small diameter, 0.005, diameter fluorocarbon leader so that it goes through and connects to that fly very, very nicely, and I still get a natural movement to that fly under the surface of the water. If I'm using a fly that small, say a 2X tippet, that fly is going to be tied very stiff and tight to that leader material, and it's not going to have a natural dead drift under the surface of the water. So, once again, just to recap, we're not matching up the breaking strength of the tippet material to the size of fish that we're catching. We're trying to match up the diameter of the tippet material to the fishing conditions and the size of flies that we're going to be using. All right, let's talk about how we're going to attach that leader that you just bought to the fly line. Now, some fly lines, when you buy them, they have a small loop connection already incorporated into the design of the fly line. If you have a fly line like this, it's very, very easy to connect the leader to it. In fact, some leaders actually come with a second loop right here. Now, all you would do is simply slide that loop through, take the other end of the leader, slide it through that loop and pull it tight, and you have this loop-to-loop connection. It's very easy to do that. However, all fly lines don't come with a loop-to-loop connection, nor do all tippet materials or all leader materials. So, if you have a line like this one right here that has a straight end to it, no loop connection, you're going to have to learn how to tie a nail knot. Now, a nail knot is not something you're going to do very often. Typically, you're only going to attach the butt section of the leader to your fly line once or twice a season, or when you change to a new fly line. So it's not something you do very often. Whereas the blood knot, the uni-knot, the improved clinch knot, those are knots you use every time you're on the water. You're going to have to become very, very proficient at those and practice them a lot. This is a knot you don't do very often, but I'll show you a very easy way to do it. And it actually takes a little tool called a nail knot tool. So what we're going to do is we're going to, first of all, I'm going to grab a piece of that 3X leader again, just for demonstration purposes. I wouldn't typically be using this type of leader material, but it's just for a demonstration, and I'll show you how to tie that knot. We'll take the end of your fly line and slide it right up in the channel, the groove of the nail knot tool. And because I'm right-handed, I typically hold that in my left hand. And you'll notice here that I've left about an inch or two extended out the other end of the nail knot tool, which I push down and hold firmly in place with my left hand. I'm going to take my leader material, the monofilament, and slide it in the opposite direction through the nail knot tool. And there's a little channel that it lays right down inside here. Now, I'm going to take that leader material and wrap it over the top of that channel about 7 times. And as I do that, what I'm creating is a strong connection point. Okay, now it's wrapped over the top. I take the tag end and I slide it right down through that channel till it comes out this end, just like that. Now I've got this little tag end. Now by quickly pulling that wrapped piece of monofilament off the top of the channel of the nail knot tool, it'll slide right onto the fly line, just like this. Then I can simply pull the monofilament out, grab both ends of the monofilament, and pull that down nice and tight. You notice how now that connection is very, very tight and very, very thin diameter, not much larger than the fly line itself, right over the top of that fly line. Once again, this is where that sharp cutting tool comes in. I'll run that cutting tool right down close to that knot and clip off that little piece of fly line on that end. And on the nail knot side, the tag end of the monofilament, I'll trim that down nice and close as well. And now I have a firm connection to my fly line with my leader material, and that'll hold just as strong as that loop-to-loop connection. Very easy to do as long as you have a nail knot tool. It's a very difficult knot to tie without this tool. But that's a great way to attach leader to a brand new fly line. Don't have to do it very often, but you definitely want to practice that. All right, so you're out fishing, and let's say you've lost a fish, or maybe you've got hooked up on the bottom and you've broken everything off, and you need to add some more tippet material to the leader. Well, there's a good way and there's a bad way to attach two types of monofilament line together. If you were to tie a basic overhand knot like we've all done for most of our lives, that knot would be very weak and it would also be very big and thick and it just wouldn't work very well for this application. So there's two different types of knots that we can use. Now the difference in why I use those at different times is fairly straightforward, fairly simple. Using thicker monofilament line, say down to 0x, I'll just about always use what I call, and what the industry calls, a blood knot. Now a blood knot, we're basically attaching two pieces of line. For example, this line in my right hand represents the line that comes from my fly rod on my leader material. The line in my left hand will represent the tippet that goes down to the fly. And I might want to add extra length on, or I might want to go down to a smaller diameter based on fishing conditions. In order to do that, I need a good quality knot, and this is the blood knot. I'm going to take these two pieces of monofilament. Now you notice that they have kind of a natural bend in it, almost steer horns, if you will. Okay? I try to get those steer horns pointing up and away from each other like this right here. I'm simply going to cross that over, and because I'm right-handed, I'm going to start by pinching that X in my left hand. With my right hand now, I'm going to take this tag end and wrap it over the top of the leader side 3 times. Once, twice, 3 times. Now you'll notice that I've created a little hole right here, a little gap in between my finger and the leader material. I'm going to take this tag end now and push it through that hole away from my body. I'm going to grab that in this hand, pull that up slightly, and now I'm going to change hands holding that same X that I had originally held in my left hand. Now I've got the same piece of tag end material with a little steer horn pointing up in the air, but it's on this side of the leader material. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap it over the top of the tippet side of the leader towards me 3 times. Once, twice, and 3 times. Now, you see I've still created a nice little gap right there. There's a little hole for that to force through. Now, from on the opposite side of the line, I'm going to push the tag end through that hole and pull it up slightly. And if I just change hands and hold those 2 tag ends up in the air, you'll see a nice little figure 8 looking loop. Okay? I'm going to hold that together right where they all intersect. Grab those 2 tag ends in my teeth. I'm not cutting them off with my teeth. Please don't do that. Use a pair of nippers to cut line. But I'm just going to hold those, and I'm going to use both hands and pull these apart, just like this. Just like that. You notice when I did that, once again, as important all the time, is I got that monofilament wet slightly so that that line would slide together and maintain its strength and also slide together much tighter. Now I'm just going to reach up, grab my nippers, cut that off very close on both sides, and what you see is a very compact, even, and very strong knot. That's called the blood knot. Now, I personally think this is probably one of the hardest knots to tie for the beginner. This is one that I strongly suggest you take a look at on a website, look at how it's actually done, review this video over and over, and whatever you do, practice before you go to the river. Because when it's cold out and the wind's blowing and the fish are rising and boy, you want to get back in the water real quick and you're fumbling to try to tie a blood knot for the very first time, it can be a problem. So practice at home while you're watching the movie and then go to the river knowing how to tie a quality blood knot. All right, now we're going to show you how to tie the next knot that's used to attach 2 pieces of monofilament. Now, I typically use this knot when I'm attaching very small diameters of monofilament. Once again, for demonstration purposes, I'm using that 0.3x tippet so you can see it very easily. But if I'm attaching, say, a 4x tippet to a 6x, very small diameter, I'm going to use a knot. It's called a triple surgeon. Once again, the line in my right hand here will represent the line that actually comes from my leader. The line in my left hand represents the rest of the tip material that's going to go down to my fly. I'm simply going to lay those 2 pieces of line over the top of each other like this. Now, to help them stay together, I like to just run those through my mouth and make them slightly wet, and you can see how they stick together better. Okay, now I'm going to make a one-hand overhand loop away from my body with my left hand and make a cross. Okay, I'll do that one more time. I'm right-handed, so I'm going to move my right hand towards my body, creating a loop, bringing those two together, and holding that intersection between my index finger and my thumb. Now, I have the leader material that goes out to my fly, and I have this small tag end. I'm now going to wrap that through this hole 3 times, both pieces, and make sure you take both. If you just take one part, the knot will not hold. So, take the tag end and the leader, push it right through that hole, reach from the other side, and pull it through. That's once. And I push it through again. That's twice. And I reach around, push it through again. That's 3 times. Now, before I tighten it, you'll see what we have here. It just looks like an overhand knot, but it's wrapped 3 times. That's why it's called the triple surgeon. Once again, I'm going to start pulling that together, and as I do that, I'm going to get that knot wet. And I'm going to simply pull that together nice and tight, and tighten it up this way. And now what you have is a very nice, tight, very strong knot that I can slide my nippers up very close, trim off those 2 tag ends, and I've got a monofilament to monofilament connection that will absolutely hold. And I also think that this knot is actually a little bit stronger than the blood knot, especially for small diameter lines. It's also much easier to tie any time of the year. Cold weather conditions, it's definitely the way to go. This is called the triple surgeon. This is probably the knot that you're going to use, I'm going to say 90% of the time. It's for attaching your tippet material to your fly. Now, for demonstration purposes, I'm going to use a great big old fly so you can see it a little bit easier. And I'm also going to use a very thick diameter. This is an 03X, very thick diameter tippet material. So basically you're going to start, if you're right-handed, I start with my fly in my left hand, leader material in my right, and I'm simply going to push that leader material up through the eye of the fly. And I'm going to make one loop like this. I'm still holding that nice and tight in my hand. Now, with my left hand, I'm going to rotate the body of the fly to put twists into the line. Now, the number of twists varies depending on the size of the fly and the size of the material. But for the most part, I'm going to put 6 or 7 twists in that line. Now you've noticed that I have a nice little loop right here, and I'm going to take the tag end of that leader material and slide it right through that loop, just like that, until it comes out the other side. Now I'm going to grab it with this part of my finger and push up through that same hole that I've created now and pull it tight so it looks kind of like that right there. Now, here's a very important part. Monofilament will actually heat up and weaken as you draw it down tight together. So every time you make a knot, and I don't care what kind of knot that you tie, I'm going to encourage you to just get the knot slightly wet. And I do that by just running it through my lips. Just like that. That's all it takes. Now I'm simply going to draw that knot down tight, just like that. See how tight that is to the eye of the hook? It's a very nice, small, compact knot. Then I'm just going to reach down, grab my nipper tool, and trim that excess off very tight to the eye of that hook. That's called the improved clinch knot, and it's a knot that you'll use for attaching almost every fly, especially dry flies, to your tippet material. Very, very strong knot. The next knot that we're going to tie is going to be called the uni knot. Now, the first one we tied was called the improved clinch, and for demonstration purposes, I'm going to use the same nice big fly and the same 03X tippet material so you can see it a little bit easier. But if you remember, the last knot that we tied, after we ran it through the eye, wrapped it around, came back through that hole and tightened it down, it was very tight to the eye of the hook. Now the next knot, this uni knot, I often will use this knot only when I'm using streamers, and I'll show you why. We're going to start the same way exactly. We're going to slide it through the eye of that hook, but we're going to take out a little bit more line than we did the first time. Now with my left hand, I'm just going to hold that line together right by the eye of the hook. I don't need to use my other hand. I can simply leave that tag end hanging free. Now, by grabbing this line and making one nice loop underneath and pinching that in my hand, again my left hand, now the tag end is pointing straight up. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take this tag end and wrap it over the leader material and the loop right through that hole, and we're going to do that 4 times. I hope you can see this. This is a very important knot, and I'll explain why in just a minute. Okay, now that you've done that, you can see that that line is wrapped over the top of both the leader and through the hole that we've made, and now we're simply going to pull that knot nice and tight. Once again, every knot that you tie, get it slightly wet so it doesn't heat up and become weaker. Now we're going to slowly pull that knot in tight to the eye of the hook. Just as before, we're going to take our line cutter, and again, this is why it's so important to have a nice, sharp line cutter, very easy to use. We're going to slide it up close to that eye and cut off that little tag end piece. Now, those 2 knots look almost identical. Here's the difference in this knot. Being called a uni knot, it's actually a sliding knot, and I can grab my fingernails and open up this loop. And I hope you can see that all right. But now the difference is, this knot is not tight to the eye of the hook. It actually has a much larger loop. When the streamer fly is being pulled through the water, it has the ability to dive and move around more because the knot is not tight to the eye of the hook. Now, once you hook up and catch a fish, that knot is going to slide tight again to the eye of the hook. Just remember, after you land the fish and you're ready to catch another one, before you make your cast, use your fingernails, open that loop up again, and you've got that nice open loop to give your fly a lot more action. This is called the uni knot. I typically use it only on streamers. I wouldn't use this on dry flies, but it really gives a lot more action to the fly, and I think it's very, very important to use streamers only. Okay, we're just about ready to hit the water. Let's talk about rigging now. How do I actually get set up to approach the river? Well, we really have 3 different methods we're going to talk about today. One is just a basic dry fly. The next would be a subsurface presentation using a very small subsurface fly, a nymph if you would, and then what we call a dry dropper or a hopper dropper rig. We're going to start with the one that everybody would love to do as often as possible, and that is a regular dry fly. Now, we've all seen movies that have beautiful action of fly fishing and a gentleman or a woman standing on the river making these beautiful long casts with a dry fly, and it's floating across the surface and a fish comes up and eats that fly. There's really nothing more exciting in fly fishing than to see that presentation and that take on top of the water. But I want you to remember something. About 90% of the fish feed subsurface. So, for the most part, I like to fish where the fish are feeding, and that is below the surface of the water, but there's nothing better than to be able to catch them on top. So let's talk about that to start with. Now again, for demonstration purposes, I'm going to use a fairly large fly. What I've picked here is a stimulator pattern. It's very, very large, floats very high in the water, great fly to use during some times of the year, but again, we're going to talk about flies in a little while, but this isn't going to work all the time, and it's not going to work in all places. Sometimes you have to go down to a very, very tiny little fly, maybe even size 22 or 24, 16, 18, lots of different sizes, but the application is the same. What I've started with is the leader that comes from my fly rod, and it ended in a 2x diameter, but that's not small enough for this particular fishing condition. So I've stepped it down to a 4x diameter using a triple surgeon knot. Then I've stepped it down one more time to a 5x diameter, again using the triple surgeon knot. And now I have my fly, and I'm going to attach it to that 5x tippet using that improved clinch knot that we practiced a little while ago. So we're simply going to slide it through the eye of the hook, wrap it back, spin the fly about 5 or 6 times, go through the hole, and tie that improved clinch knot. Now, that's all there is to it. I'm simply going to have that fly attached to the end of my tippet. I'm going to go to the water and make my first presentation. Before I do that, I'll probably coat this fly with a little bit of fly floatant. The fly floatant comes in a little bottle like this. This happens to be called gink, and I simply put a little tiny amount. Don't put too much on it. It actually will hurt its ability to float on the surface. But after the hackles and the hair material gets wet, if you don't use this, the fly will start to sink, won't stay on the top long enough. So I always put on a little bit of the fly floating material on top of any dry fly I use to help it float a little bit higher. One thing I would be very careful about is when you apply it to the fly, try not to get any of the floating material on the leader itself. That'll just make that leader stand a little bit taller in the film of the water, and the fish will actually see that a little bit. So it's a good idea not to get any of the floating material actually on the tippet itself. That's a dry fly presentation. Very easy, very straightforward. Match the hatch, find the right fly for what the fish are feeding on, and go catch a big one. Now let's talk about subsurface presentations. Now if you see my little fly box here, you see it's full of every different color, shape, size. I have egg patterns, I have small mayfly imitations, I've got bigger streamers, many different flies. And again, it would take way too long for me to describe how and when I use every one of these, but let's talk about how we set it up. To begin with, there's both single and multiple subsurface presentations. To begin with, I might take a larger fly, like this prince nymph. It's called a beadhead prince nymph because it's got a little gold bead head on the top. And just like I started with that dry fly, I'm simply going to run this 5X tippet through the eye of that hook. I'm going to spin it around, take the tag end. It's going to go through that little hole that I created there and back up through the second hole, getting the knot wet and pulling it tight. Okay, now if I was to fish a single subsurface fly, that might be what it looks like. This fly is actually weighted a little bit and it will get down in slower and shallower conditions. However, what I'm probably going to have to do is add some weight to this fly to get it down to where the fish are actually feeding. For the most part, those fish are feeding right on the bottom. Now certainly there are emerger patterns that the fish are feeding on that are somewhere in the water column between the bottom and on the surface. That's for a different day. But for right now, we're talking about fishing on the bottom with weighted flies or with a weighted fly and actually some weight on the leader. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab some split shot. And the split shot comes in many different sizes and weights and different materials. Some are lead, and this particular one here is a non-lead material, which is non-toxic, much better to use. It's actually tin material. I'm simply going to dispense one piece of split shot, slide that up my line about 18 inches above the fly. I just lay the split shot, or excuse me, lay the line right through that little slot in the split shot. Not with my teeth now, please. Your dentist will love you, but I suggest you don't do that. Don't use your teeth to pinch that closed. Use a little pair of forceps and tighten that right on the line. Now what I've got is a subsurface presentation with some weight here to get it down in the water column where the fish are feeding, and a fly here that's also weighted and will stay down there but float slightly off the bottom. Now, in order to tell when we have a hit, we're actually going to use what we call a strike indicator. And there's lots of different types of strike indicators. One of my favorites is a nice little indicator like this. It's actually made out of plastic, and it's got air trapped inside of it, so it floats very high. Okay? We're going to go up our line depending on how deep the water is. The general rule is that I'll take and move my indicator up the fly line from the fly approximately 1.5 to 2 times the depth of water that I'm fishing in. So I'm fishing in, say, 4 feet of water. I'm going to go up between 6 and 8 feet up my line and attach my strike indicator. This particular one is very easy. I just make one small loop with my leader, push it through that hole, put the indicator through it, and pull it tight, and it's in position. So now I've got my indicator attached in the right height on my leader, depending on how deep of water that I'm fishing in. That runs right down to that piece of split shot, which acts as weight to get lower in the water, and then down to my actual subsurface fly. As a fish actually inhales that fly under the surface, this indicator will either twitch or it might be pulled straight under the water, signaling that you've had a hit and you set the hook. Okay? Very simple method. We can often take one step further than that and actually use multiple flies subsurface. Now there's times that you know exactly what they're eating and you want to focus just on that one fly. Many times I like to kind of double up the action a little bit and give them two different things to select from as it's floating down the river. So on the top, I'll use a little bit larger fly. This is a good example. This print sniff, very effective pattern in most western waters. But below that, I might use a very small little nymph, maybe a size 20 or even a size 18. Lots of them to choose from. I might pick a small midge pattern or an RS2, something like that. And what I'll do is I'll actually take, again, that 5X or even 6X tippet, tie an improved clinch knot to the bend of the hook right on my first fly, extend that down about 18 inches, 12 to 18 inches, and tie another improved clinch knot to my second small fly. So now as I'm fishing that presentation, I actually have two flies. I'm doubling my chances to get a hit, and why not? You may as well do that. There's no rules against it. You can actually use 3 if you'd like, but casting becomes a little more difficult, so that's why you might not want to do that, at least to begin with. But certainly, when I'm fishing subsurface, I'm almost always using a double fly rig, small split shot above it, strike indicator above to let me know when that fish is eating, and I'll tell you what, it's a very effective way to fish. Once again, remember, about 90% of the fish feed subsurface. So if you're seeing 10 fish rising, there might be 90 more below the surface eating. And quite honestly, I'd rather fish to those 90 than just the 10 on the top. Multiple fly, subsurface rig. Sometimes we like to use what we call a dry dropper or a hopper dropper rig. And what a hopper dropper rig is we're going to go back, and I'll use this as an example. This nice big dry fly, it's called a stimulator pattern. I use this as an example to begin with when we were talking about dry flies. Now, for a hopper dropper rig, that particular fly needs to be pretty big, because what you're going to do is you're going to take a very small tippet, say a 6X, maybe even a 7X, and tie a section of that leader right to the bend of the hook of your big dry fly that sits on the surface. Very similar to the multiple fly rig subsurface, the difference is you have a dry fly that is floating across the surface, and then just below that, not all the way to the bottom, but about 18 inches below that is going to be a very small little emerger pattern. So you may in fact get a hit on the dry fly on the top, or that fish may see that emerger floating subsurface below that and eat that fly. And when that happens, this acts kind of like your strike indicator, and that fly will be pulled subsurface. You simply set the hook and the fun is on. So, dry dropper or hopper dropper. A lot of people called it a hopper dropper rig because many times you use large hopper patterns, and I do have a couple examples. I carry a lot of big, large flies. Now, here's a great big old hopper pattern. That even looks like a grasshopper, doesn't it? This is a great multiple fly hopper dropper or dry dropper rig because it floats very high on the surface. I can actually suspend a much bigger fly underneath that because this foam material floats very, very well on top and won't be pulled under by the weight of that second fly. That's really why you don't use a very small dry fly on top, because it's not buoyant enough to support the weight of the second fly underneath. Okay, so let's recap. If you started with these 3 methods, you're going to be able to catch fish in almost any conditions out there. Basic dry fly, when those fish are feeding on the surface and there's a big hatch going on, you want to match that hatch, find the flies that they're eating in the right size, and size is important. Not only is it the right pattern, but you might be fishing a dry fly pattern that is only 1 or 2 sizes bigger than the natural insect, and you're probably not going to catch fish. So the size is very important. Basic dry fly presentation. We're going to talk about how we cast that and present it on the water in a minute, but that's the first step. Second is subsurface. Remember, 90% of the fish feed subsurface. So we're going to want to fish with a strike indicator, some sort of subsurface fly that represents what the fish are eating, that is weighted down, either the fly itself or in a combination with an additional piece of split shot in order to get it down to the level the fish are eating. And the final presentation, the hopper dropper rig or the dry dropper, using a large floating fly on the surface with a small piece of tippet material, 6 or 7x, sometimes 5, but typically around 6x, down to a small emerger pattern that is just below the surface. Those three methods are going to catch fish just about every place you go, and I don't know about you, but I'm ready to go out and give it a try. We're going to rig up here. I know I've got some fish out here because I was looking in the water a few minutes ago, and let's go see if we can't catch a few, all right? Okay, we're out here in the river. We're ready to start to learn how to make our first fly cast, all right? Right now what you see, I only have about 30 feet of fly line, and I have it straight out in front of me. What I want you to think about is making this as easy as possible. So many people get out in the water with a fly rod in their hand for the first time, and you see so much action in their arms, so much movement in their body, because they think they have to put all this effort into making the cast. What we want to do is start with the rod pointing at our target this direction. And when we bring it back with good force, good line speed, we're going to come to a hard stop with the rod pointing up in the air at approximately 2 o'clock, right back up like this. We don't want the rod to lay flat this way. If we lay the rod flat behind us, what we get is a big S loop, a big arcing motion. My wrist is breaking, my arm is giving too much action, like this. That's typically what happens when you first start to cast. So, foot position is also important. I want to start with my weight slightly on my forward leg, with my toe pointing forward. My back leg is at about a 45-degree angle, even though you can't see it in the water right here. When I pick up my fly line, I'm going to pick it up nice and fast, but I'm going to make a hard stop right up here at 2 o'clock. Like this, stop, and go, and then drop. So I've got a hard stop at 2, a hard stop at 10, and then I'm going to finish the forward cast by dropping the rod tip to the water. It looks like this. Now you notice I am only using one hand at this point. And again, I'm not using my whole arm, right? My elbow is staying tight to my body, just like this. The loop is nice and tight. I'm expending very little effort. It's a very easy process. Hard stop at 2, 10, 2, 10, 2, and 10, and release to make the presentation. Also notice that I'm keeping control of the fly line in my rod hand. My left hand is at my side. We're going to throw in our left hand into the fly cast in just a minute, but for right now, it's all with our right hand. My elbow stays close to my body. Hard stop at 2, hard stop at 10 o'clock, and it looks like this. And this is just the false cast. Okay, now we've learned the basics about a hard stop at 2 o'clock and a hard stop at 10, and keeping our right elbow in tight to our body, not using a lot of arm action, not getting this big S cast by dropping the rod horizontally to the river behind us and horizontally in front of us, keeping the rod tip up high. There are times we might need a little bit more line speed, or we might need to make a little bit longer cast. If I only have as much line as in my hand right here, That's all I can throw because I'm holding on to it with my right rod hand. Now, we're going to move our left hand into the equation here. And instead of always being in control here with my right hand, I'm going to take the line out and pinch it between my two fingers, my thumb and my forefinger of my left hand. Everything stays the same in the cast, but now as I'm making those false casts, when I'm prepared to make the presentation, I'm going to let line slide through these fingers and shoot the line further out. And what you'll see is that I have about 10 or 12 feet here of extra line. And you'll see this line go shooting through the guides and towards my intended target. It looks like this. And when we're ready, we're on target, we're going to shoot that line just like that. And you notice that all that line is taken out through the guides, and I've reached that target further out in front of me. That's a simple shooting technique, and you can use that to gain extra distance when you need it. Okay, now we've learned how to bring our left hand into the equation, all right? Now we're going to learn a hauling technique, which helps us pick up line speed in windy conditions and to gain a little bit extra length in our cast if we happen to need that. And basically we're going to start with our hands together. And as we pick it up, we're going to pull hard down on the line to pick up the line speed and then shoot the line out in front of us. And it's going to look like this. And then all that line goes shooting out, and we've picked up line speed, makes it very, very easy to gain some extra distance. Or if you've got real windy conditions, it helps you bust that line through that hard wind to reach those fish you couldn't have gotten before. Now there will be times that a straight cast doesn't give you that nice dead drift, and there is a way to do this by mending the line in the air. It's called a reach cast. So instead of laying the line straight out in front of me, I'm actually going to reach to the left side of my body with my rod hand as I make my final presentation. And it looks a lot like this. Now you can see I've positioned that line upstream from the fly, and I've got a nice dead drift still. One little mend will continue that float. Fly is still on the surface. Now I can really start to begin to cast almost directly across stream and have a longer dead drift because of the reach cast. Okay, here's another cast that might come in handy. It's called an S cast or a snake cast. And what it allows me to do is put a big snake-looking turn in my line so it keeps that dry fly floating nice and dead without any drag for a longer period of time, especially when I'm casting straight across the current like this. So as I make my final presentation to the water, I'm going to throw a little snake cast or a little S into the loop of the line, and it looks like this. Now as that floats down the river, you can see I can actually take up that slack, and the fly still hadn't turned yet. It gives me a much longer dead drift if I have to cast right straight across the current. I'll do that one more time. There it is. Nice dead drift, straight across, and that fly didn't start swinging until the very end. It gives me a much longer dead drift. It's a very easy cast to do and kind of a lot of fun also. Sometimes I'm fishing straight downstream, right at a small piece of pocket water. With a dry fly, if I make a cast right at that with full extension on the line, I have no dead drift. Almost immediately, that fly is sinking and swinging out of the zone where the fish are living. So I'm going to do what I call a pile cast. And it just goes kind of like this. I'm going to throw it up in the air a little bit and pull the rod tip back. And now I've got slack line above it, and I'm still getting that nice dead drift right down into the zone where the fish are. So, make the same cast at the last minute, pull the rod tip back, and let it float right in. This is a great downstream technique. A lot of times I'll be walking down the bank, fishing small pockets, and I'll just make a little cast, pull the rod tip back, and follow it down. Take a couple steps. My fly is still floating right on top. Dry it off a little bit, reach back, drop it in the water, and I'm going to follow it right down. Very effective cast for fishing downstream. Just like that. About 90% of the fish feed subsurface. So, if the fish are feeding down low, I like to get down to them. To do that, we're using an indicator about 6 feet, in this case, because we're pretty shallow water, above our nymphs. Now, the important part is, as I make this cast, it's a pretty easy roll cast, but I can't let that indicator start swinging in the drift, so I'm going to mend my line and constantly keep it upstream so I have a nice dead drift as that indicator floats through the drift. I just keep working that line above it, and that way that indicator is not sliding across the surface of the water, which means my fly would be coming up out of the zone where the fish live. When it gets down to the bottom, I just simply let my rod hang straight downstream, let it swing inside a little bit. Again, nice line control in my right hand. I've always got the line right here. Now I'm just going to use my left hand, pull and roll cast, and as soon as it starts coming down, I'm just going to pick my rod tip up and flip that line upstream from my indicator, and now I've got a nice dead drift. I might need to do that 1 or 2 more times throughout that drift to keep that indicator from moving and sliding. That way it's a perfectly natural presentation, and that's when the fish like to eat. Now here's another good lesson. Really important too. When I'm fishing an area like this, I need to judge the approximate depth of this water. What I've got here is it appears that I'm fishing in about 3.5 to 4 feet of water. The distance between my strike indicator and my fly needs to be approximately 1.5 to 2 times the depth of the water. Now you can't be exact. So what I've done now, a minute ago, I actually moved my strike indicator up on my fly line a little bit. And I think I actually moved it up too much because now I'm dragging the bottom a little bit too much. So I'm going to move that indicator down about a foot from where it was, maybe 18 inches, and that should help me get a little bit more of a dead drift. So you're always constantly moving that indicator. That's why it's really important you pick an indicator that's that easy to move up and down on your fly line. There's lots of different kinds of indicators. Some stick onto the fly line. This happens to be called a thingamabobber. It has a nice round hole on the top, and you can throw a little half hitch loop through it. Very easy to change the depth, move it up and down, doesn't affect your fly line at all. But once again, you're looking to have your indicator about 1.5 to 2 times the depth of the water that you're fishing in. Now I've got a much better drift. Now here's something else very important. Okay, so you're drifting through a drift like this, and you're watching that indicator. How do you know if it's a fish or the bottom? Bottom line is, once you make a couple drifts, you'll know if you either have too much weight or if your indicator is too high. If you're constantly bumping the bottom, you know you might want to take off a little bit of weight or change that indicator. But here's the bottom line. If that indicator stops, twitches, moves, whatever it happens to do, something is affecting on the bottom. It's either a rock, a stick, or a fish. Set the hook. Doesn't hurt you to set the hook. Just make sure you don't miss that fish by going, well, I don't know if that was really a fish or not. Pretty soon you feel your line being ripped away from you, and it really was a fish. So if there's any question, set the hook.
Now, I've just made a cast. Noticed immediately, as soon as I make that cast, that fly line is in my control again, underneath my fingers on my rod hand. Once that line gets downstream and I need to strip some back in before my next cast, I'm doing all the stripping right behind my rod hand right here. Rather than trying to reach up here and strip, I release it every time and I've always got to start over again. Show you that one more time. Make a nice roll cast. Immediately, the line gets into control underneath the fingers of my rod hand. As I continue to watch the drift go downstream and I get into position to make my next cast, I want to make a few strips in, and I'm stripping it right behind the fingers of my rod hand, lift my rod tip, and a nice roll cast. I want you to get a look at what a nice dead drift looks like with the strike indicator. I'm going to mend the line just above that indicator, very slowly, carefully, not to move it a lot. It's drifting straight downstream. Fly line is upriver. A little mend again, just like that. Now, if your indicator does this with the fly line downstream and it starts to swing and slide across the river like this, that's not getting a dead drift. That's when you're going to not catch fish because that fly is coming up off the bottom where the fish are eating. You got to mend that line above so it doesn't swing across the river like this.
There we go. There's a good fish too. Nice. Now that one was right down at the end of the tail out. Kind of on the small side. Got a nice little fish. Now when you're fighting these fish, it's really a good idea not to keep your rod straight up in the air. Lay it over to the side a little bit like this. Fish's direction. We're going to let him work a little bit here. Now what I've done, you see, I haven't tried to get all the fly line onto the reel. I'm controlling it with my rod hand still. And I'm going to strip it in. And when I feel like I've got the fish pretty much under control, then I can bring the fly line back onto the reel. And at any time, what I've done here is I've still got the control with my right hand. Okay? So if that fish makes a big run, I can simply let line slide out through this hand. So I'm actually using my hand as a drag as much as anything else. So now the fish is still under control. I've got him on the reel. Now I can let go with my right hand. The fish is out in the current, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to try to slide my rod over to the left side, a little more towards the bank.
Not a lot of pressure. I don't want to break off. I'm using a 6X tippet here, so it's fairly light, even though this fish isn't real big. This water's nice and slow here, so I'm just going to ease back, grab my net, and I'm going to slide this fish up and right into the net, just like that. I'm just going to lay my rod down right here. I never want to touch the fish with dry hands, okay? You actually take the slime off the side of the fish, and that's not good for them. So without even touching the fish, I'm just going to grab a pair of hemostats. I'm going to reach down, pop that hook out. It comes out very easy. It's a barbless hook. Fish is nicely controlled inside the net. Just going to turn him over, make sure he's good. It's not a big fish, 16 inches long. I've got a measure in the bottom of my net here. And I'm going to cradle the fish without even lifting him out of the water. Face him right up into the current a little bit. Make sure everything is good. And you'll know, and there he goes.
Hey, we sure hope you've enjoyed Wright McGill's Essentials of Fly Fishing, and I hope that you've learned everything you need to know about being a great fly fisherman or fly girl. I'm Al Noriker for the Wright McGill Company, and guess what? I'm going fishing.